Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters, and welcome to this week's live chat. Sorry I missed last week. It was my daughter's first tennis game or tennis match. Meet. I don't even know the terminology, but I had to make sure I got to that and it was a lot of fun. But I'm back this week and I'm ready to talk about swirls. And if you are watching live, I have a giveaway. So leave a comment in the comments section and Jessica will pick a winner at the end of the live chat. The prize is going to be a training wheels kit for swirls because I've got swirls on my mind. We'll talk more about that here in a second. So leave a comment and good luck winning. As normal, Jessica is behind the computer. She's monitoring that chat and writing down your questions. So if you have a question, let us know and I'll answer it live. In today's live chat, like I said, I'm going to share some tips for machine quilting swirls, kind of because I have swirls on the mind. I'm putting together our next free motion challenge quilting along, and it's going to be about swirls. So I thought, well, since it's already top of mind, let's talk through it. So I have some pictures and some suggestions, but really everything that I say, that I'm going to say, is not super groundbreaking. It's just those little things that will help you be successful with your swirls. So whether you're trying to learn them for the first time or you're trying to refine them, hopefully these will help you out. So when it comes to quilting swirls, and this is for either machine or really wherever you're at, here are just some practical things. But first, like, why should you learn swirls? Well, I mean, if you're a machine quilter, you probably love them. I love swirls. I'm a swirl girl all the way. The thing about swirls is that you can take that shape and change it up and create so many different variations with it. It's just a versatile design that can work in all areas of your quilt. I like to joke, but it is true. If you just learn a swirl, filler, and continuous curve, you can quilt any quilt out there. And if you were only going to learn one design, it would be swirls. So if you're stuck on a desert island and you have the option, take the swirls. But they work, like I said, in so many different ways, whether you extend them out and do some elongated kind of shapes, whether you shrink them down and fill in around areas, whether you do it over the whole quilt or as a tight filler. It's just one of those great versatile shapes. But it is also one of those shapes that you have to practice and refine. So let's talk through those particular tips and hopefully we'll get you on the swirl path. All right, first up, keep the momentum. Now, I just have a picture of some swirls right here, but when you're quilting those curves, you really want to keep the quilting going. Now, I understand when you're trying a new design and you're frustrated, you want to stop and obsess about how bad you're doing or how good you're doing. But really, the more you keep going, the more you'll get that momentum. You'll keep that momentum going. If we think about that curve that we're quilting or that nice round shape, if I were to tell you to quilt really slowly, it would be hard to keep that line smooth. But when you're going faster and you're not stopping, you're keeping that momentum going. It's kind of a long-running joke in my house. If I'm quilting and the kids come in, well, they don't come in anymore because they're older, but when they would come in and see me, they would want to talk to me. I'm like, hold on a second, let me finish these pebbles, because it's the stopping and starting that kind of breaks up that momentum. Now, I get it. When you're learning a design, it's super scary. And you're like, but just keep going because we're focusing on those smooth lines. So try not to stop a lot, especially if you're just going to stop and beat yourself up over your quilting. That's no fun, but just keep on going. If you've tried learning swirls and you're like, Angela, I can't do it. No matter what you say, it's not working. Well, try it in a defined area. If you think about the swirl design, it's a all over kind of filler shape. That means it just kind of goes everywhere. But sometimes for some quilters, that's a little overwhelming. Go wherever you want. Echo, I don't have a problem with that. But if it might help you if you had a defined area to fill in. It's just one less thing to think about when you're quilting those swirls. It just gives you that boundary. So in this example, which I talked through this quilt in a previous live chat, you can see in those elongated kind of white diamonds, I quilted a swirl in each one of them. What I love about swirls, or what I love about doing this particular technique, is you just get to fill it in and then move on. So if you're struggling with filling in an area, or you're struggling with just learning the shape, try putting it in defined area, like a block, but it could also be in a border. So if I'm wanting to quilt swirls, I'm just trying to practice that shape, quilting them in a border, a thinner kind of border might be a good option. I wish that every quilter watching this was the same, because I would have a very easy job. The problem is we're all different. And so something that might work for you might not work for someone else. So try it out, see how you feel. If filling in a defined area is a little bit easier, and then go from there. And then once you learn it, then you can expand it out into other spaces. Or just do a little swirl here and there. You don't have to jump in and quilt swirls over your whole quilt. I mean, you should, or you could, because it's a lot of fun. But when you're learning a new design, don't feel like you have to commit to it everywhere. Just throw in a few here and there, just to kind of tiptoe into it, just to kind of, get used to that idea. So giving yourself a defined area will help you out. All right, another tip, learn first, scale later. Okay, scale, I mean size. It's funny because in the type chat before I went live, I usually get on to the link about half an hour before I go live, and we chit chat and type and chat with each other. A few people were like, I struggle with smaller swirls, which I thought was kind of interesting because I would think that quilting bigger swirls can be more difficult because it's hard to sustain that curve. But in this example, if you're learning a design, such as swirls, and you're like, I want to quilt small, tiny swirls, learn the swirl shape first, and then you can scale it down or up or make it really tiny or really big. It's just a little bit less to think about, and it's not a whole lot to think about, but when we're quilting, any little bit that we can free up of our mind will really, really help. So most quilters, or when I've taught classes, most quilters will just kind of quilt a size that is comfortable for them. It just depends on the quilter. Some people will quilt really small, some will quilt really large. Try not to fight against that. Just say like, okay, this is what it is. I'm gonna quilt this size until I get comfortable with it. And then I can work scaling it down or making it bigger. And really, if you're struggling with keeping that scale, once you learn how to quilt the swirl, then you can start trying to keep that consistent scale. And one of the questions was, how do I keep the swirls little, especially if your tendency is to get bigger as you quilt? My tendency is it gets smaller as I quilt. But to keep that size consistent, just know it comes with practice, much like writing your name. But another thing you can do is visualize some real life object that's similar in size. So money is always a great option. You can be like, oh, I want to make my swirl quarter size, or whatever coin you might have for my international friends. Just having that real life thing to kind of relate to it will help out. Another thing that can help, and this is something I did way back in the beginning, is I would actually draw out the size that I wanted and kind of keep it right next to my machine. That way I can visually look over and make sure it's staying on track. Because as I was quilting, it would get smaller and smaller and smaller, and it was always kind of crazy. So don't feel like you have to learn the size and then, the swirl. Just learn the design and then scale it down. All right, fill it in. This is probably the hardest thing. You cannot judge your quilting by one swirl alone. You can't pick out that swirl and say if it looks good or not. You have to keep filling in the area. And that's really hard. I understand. You quilt the swirl, you're not loving how it looks, and I'm telling you to keep going. But what I want to see is the whole area filled in. And once you get to that point and you step back and you look at it, you realize that each individual swirl isn't standing out so much. It's just kind of blending in with the rest of the quilt. And when I'm done, that's what I want to see, that nice overall texture. So in this example, this was from our Fillers Free Motion Challenge. I was quilting with red thread on this tan fabric. And if you start to really pay attention to the swirls, you'll see, they're not all the same size. They don't quite look all the same shape. But really, when you step back and look at the whole overall effect, it's going to look nice. So keep filling in that area. Now, that means if I'm practicing, I will give myself a section to fill in, whether it's a block, whether it's the space around the blocks, whatever it is, just make sure you keep filling it in. Now, one thing I didn't really go into detail with this is echoing. When I'm quilting a meander, or this particular design that goes in all different directions, meandering, I'm going to use echoing to help me maneuver around. So don't be afraid to echo those swirls and get to the next one. If you're quilting and you're filling in that area and you're thinking, Angela is so full of crap, I hate this, I hate swirls. Hopefully you're not thinking that. But if you get stuck, stop quilting and use your finger to kind of trace out the next few steps. It'll really kind of help your brain visualize where you're going next, kind of help you fill in any of those gaps while you're there, and then move on. So just keep going, keep going. It's kind of like the Finding Nemo, but keep quilting, keep quilting. And this is especially the case if you're working with areas that are irregularly shaped. So in this example, it was from a video. You can always tell my quilting samples that are from a video because the thread colors are such crazy combinations. I'm not going to suggest that you quilt with green thread on light gray fabric, but I want to make sure you can see it in the videos I've put together. But when I'm filling in those irregular areas, such as in between those points, I'm also going to use echoing. I just want to make sure there's no gaps in the quilting. If you've watched any of my live chats, you probably know that I say all the time, I don't think people will notice an error, but you'll notice a gap in your quilting. And that's just an unquilted area that tends to stand out. So fill it in. Fill it in with echoes, fill it in with other shapes, just fill in that space so that you have that nice overall texture. Again, I do know it's difficult, especially when you're like, I'm not loving it, but keep on going. I promise it's going to look good. All right, this one is a little bit more abstract. Find your swirl. So I'm sitting down, I'm thinking of like, okay, what tips can I share? There are so many swirl variations. There's tons of them, and that's why it's a great versatile shape, but they're not in any certain kind of order. Now, when I teach swirls, and when I do this next free motion challenge, we'll start with the basic swirl or just the beginner swirl, and then we'll build off of it. But you can get in on any of those swirls. So if you're looking at certain designs and you're like, man, I want to do that, it's not like I have to learn the first 5. So find the swirl that fits your personality. Now, if you're watching it and you're like, if I knew what kind of swirl I could quilt, I would just quilt it. But the idea being, as you're working through a shape, if you're struggling with something, ask yourself, what am I struggling with? I mean, you could do it out loud if nobody's around, but what part of this swirl do I not like? Is it the echoing? Is it the traveling? And then try to find a design that kind of fits into that. So this is obviously an extreme example of a swirl. It's a little bit bigger. It doesn't have as many echo lines, and I put a dense filler around it. This would be perfect for somebody that likes to quilt big swirls that doesn't like echoing, because I only have one line coming back. Now, you can pick or choose, put pebbles in there or not, but the idea being I'm taking that shape and I'm just quilting it in a slightly different way. Maybe you're struggling with nice round swirls. I'll say basic, I hate that word. I need to think of a better word for that. The basic swirl is pretty round. It doesn't have a direction. That's great. That makes it nice and static in our background area, but I can elongate that and have something that has movement. I can quilt it around a pebble just to give it a pop of unquilted area. And those elongated swirls are perfect if you're struggling with the round ones. Shoot, you might already be trying to quilt round swirls and they're ending up nice and elongated. Don't fight your natural tendencies. Just go with it, because whatever you do, as long as you do it consistently, it'll look fine. The swirl hook, maybe you want a little bit of extra to your swirl. Maybe you're already kind of doing that. Just lean into it. So don't try to fight, I guess, your natural inclinations. Kind of find those shapes that work. This particular kind of little scrolly design has more traveling than echoing. Maybe I don't mind backtracking, but I don't like echoing. So slightly different effect, slightly different look, but still the same cool idea. Now this particular swirl, I call it this concentric swirl, is a great example of this. So this particular design incorporates swirls, echoing, and a little bit of traveling. What I love about it is it kind of creates this look of depth, like the swirls are laying on top of each other. And you might think, well, gosh, it has that traveling, it might be more difficult. But some quilters don't find it more difficult. So if you're the kind of quilter that likes to have a set number of steps, tell me what to do, step 1, 2, 3, and 4, and let me go with it, you might find this one a little bit easier. Whereas the more basic swirl, it's like, just echo, move your way around the area. Less kind of regulated, you might struggle with that. So again, just because it might look complex to you doesn't mean that it's going to be harder for you to quilt. So best idea is try a bunch of different shapes or different designs and find which one that makes you feel less like vomiting and just stick with that one. Then once you learn that shape, then you can kind of come back and learn those other variations. All right, this one might seem silly, but try combining it with other designs. Now, this is a little bit of an extreme example. I've got those leaves with the pebbles, but you can see those elongated swirls in there. like I kind of already said, don't feel like you have to commit to doing them over the whole quilt. That can be scary. That can maybe not be your idea of fun. So try combining them with other shapes. What this will do is give you a different shape to kind of break up the scariness of the swirls, and also helps you tiptoe into it. So for instance, if you're watching and you're like, man, I have got the meander down. I can just do that nice wiggly line, but swirls, can't do it. Quilt the design you feel comfortable with and throw swirls in every now and again, just to kind of get used to that idea. Once you get comfortable with it, then you can start, transitioning to other designs, but use what you already know to kind of tiptoe towards those designs that you don't know, especially with swirls. Now, swirls are pretty friendly little guys. They get along with all different shapes, other designs, but if you find that you're getting gaps in your quilting, just make sure you use echoing to fill them in. But again, great way to kind of transition into it. This could be pebbles like we've seen. It could be clamshells. It could be really any shape that you feel comfortable quilting. Just remember, fill in all those gaps so that it looks good. And so here we've seen clamshells, and then that little kind of pea pod kind of shape here. It's just another example of why those swirls are great little designs. And then some more pebbles. So I was kind of looking through all my pictures, taking a walk down my quilting memory lane, and I was like, oh, I loved seeing some of those old quilts. All right, keep the spacing consistent. You knew I was probably going to say this. It's so important. If I can keep the spacing between the lines somewhat consistent, it's going to help contribute to the overall texture of the quilt. So what that means is if I quilt a swirl, I want the echo line to be, let's say, a 1/2 inch away. I want all the lines to be about a 1/2 inch apart. I love to use the foot of my machine as a guide. That means after I quilt that line, I kind of run the edge of the foot along that previously quilted line, and it helps keep it consistent. Now, that will come with practice. I know I already kind of said that. The more you do it, the easier it will get. And it also depends on the kind of machine that you're using. So on a long arm where you have such freedom of movement, sometimes it's hard to control that machine and keep that spacing where you want it. And on a sewing machine, sometimes it's hard to really force yourself to get that shape out there. It will come with practice, but if you can get to that point, it will look great, because that's how you're going to cover up your mistakes. That's how you're going to fill in gaps. You're just going to add those consistent echo lines. And it's that spacing between the lines that really determines how dense your quilting is. So if you want it really dense because you want it as a filler to make everything pop, then have a 1/4 inch spacing. If you want it less dense, spread those lines apart. But if you can, instead of looking at the swirl, just look at those lines and try to keep that spacing consistent. Now, I don't want you stressing out about this so much that you're like freaking out and making jagged lines. Try to keep that line smooth, and if it moves away, just kind of bring it closer in and know as long as it's all filled in, it's going to look good. But when we talk about keeping the spacing consistent, whether it's the basic swirl or this elongated swirl, it's fine if it's consistently inconsistent. It's kind of like that joke, once is a mistake, twice is a design rule. Whatever you do, as long as you do it all the time, it's going to look fine. So in this example, this is that same concentric swirl design with just my lines spaced out differently. Some are narrower and some are further apart. The reason it works is because it's consistent throughout that whole area. So whatever you're quilting, just keep doing it. I promise you fill that whole area in, it's going to look good. All right, last one, practice. I know. We all want to be good yesterday. But like I tell people in my classes, it took me a while. It took me some practice to get where I'm at. If you just picked up your quilt and started quilting right now and did great right off the bat, I'd feel really bad about myself. So thank you for taking my self-esteem into account. Ultimately, swirls need practice. It's so much like your handwriting. When we learned our letters, we wrote them and we wrote them and we wrote them, and every time it would get more refined, and now you can sign your name without even thinking about it. So practice really just helps refine that shape. There are some designs that aren't quite like that, like ribbon candy. It's one of those designs that kind of clicks and then you get it, but swirls is going to be refined through practice. I cannot tell you how many swirls I've drawn over the years, whether it was for practice or just for fun, but really just practicing will help your brain learn where to go. Now, I know that we do not have unlimited quilting time. It's not fair that we have to cook for our families and clean, but we do what we have to do, right? So if you can't get to your quilting machine or your sewing machine, try drawing out the design. Drawing out the shape, filling in an area like this helps your brain learn where to go, helps you fill in those gaps so that when you get to your sewing machine or your long arm, you can then refine it. We're not learning how to draw. All the time people say, well, I'm not a good drawer. I'm like, well, you don't have to be. We're just learning how to move through that area and then coming back to the machine. So very important. And like I already kind of said, give yourself a defined area. For example, in this picture, I just drew a square and I made myself draw in the swirls in there. It could be the whole quilt, but give yourself a whole area, and fill it in completely. That's going to help you deal with those corners. That's going to help you learn how to get unstuck. That's going to help you learn how to maneuver your way through the area. So it does take practice. The good news is it doesn't take as much practice as you might think. So just go for it, practice, get that down. It will really help. You can see here. What should you practice? The design you want to learn. There's no right or wrong. And this giveaway we're doing is what I like to call training wheels for quilters. It's a fabric I designed that has swirls on it. So whether you trace along a picture that you've seen, whether you draw the same shape over and over again, or you can quilt right over the lines. And again, one lucky winner is going to get that. But truly, it comes to practice. But like I said, it doesn't take as much as you might think, I promise. So when you're working on your quilts and you're trying to learn this design, or really any design, give yourself the grace and the time to practice and learn it, and I promise it won't take long until you'll be swirling all over your quilts. So, we got any questions there, Jessica? Swirls are definitely one of those designs. You know, and something else I didn't quite say, find your own style. You know, it doesn't have to look just like mine or your friend, your other quilter friend, or that person that just did show and tell in front of you with that great quilt, and you're like, oh, she went in front of me. So whatever your style is, just go with it. I write my A's rounded. You might write them pointy. They're both going to be right, so don't worry about that. The center of the swirl always seems to come to a point. Can you have it rounded to create the illusion of an endless swirl? Absolutely. Yeah, when I quilt my swirls, I'm going to use my finger movement. That's not going to help you. But I like to go in and come right back out. But you definitely could come in and make a nice curve and come right back out. Whatever you do, just do it consistently. I think that would look really cool. Have I ever done hand quilting? Yes. It's been a minute, but when I learned how to quilt, it was from Jeremy and Jessica's grandpa, and he started me by hand quilting. So I hand quilted our first several quilts. And what's funny is my first quilt was very big, and then they started getting really small after that, because when you have to hand quilt, it takes forever. Hand quilting is just so much fun. I like the idea of hand quilting, but not more than machine quilting, because I love that. But what is your stitch size and your favorite thread? So stitch size is dependent on how fast I'm moving the machine. I don't use a stitch regulator because I learned without one. So that means my machine is going at a set speed, and how fast I'm moving will determine that stitch length. If you have a stitch regulator or you're aiming for a certain stitch length, I like to say 10 to 12 stitches per inch. Now that's just like an arbitrary rule I made up. So if you're a rule breaker, ignore that. If you're a rule follower, go for it. That stitch size will get consistent with practice. So try not to worry too much about that. And my favorite thread is all of them. No, I'm just kidding. I like Glide, which is a 40 weight kind of shiny thread. I like that because it's strong enough to handle the stresses of machine quilting, but still kind of blends in. You're going to play around with different threads and you'll find your own kind of preferences with that. It's just like asking what color fabric should you make a quilt out of. It just depends on what you like. But as long as it is a high quality machine quilting thread, you can do whatever. Do I know if monofilament thread holds up well? I would think so. I don't use monofilament, which is like almost a thin thread, but yeah, I think it would hold up just the same, especially if it's a polyester thread. There is a difference between rayon, which has a lower heat temperature, but I have some quilts that I quilted with poly or monopoly, and it still looks great. So no problems there. How do I get the center to pop out? So I'm assuming that swirl that maybe ended with the circle, traveling. So traveling around that circle a couple times, building it up, and then echoing your way back out. It does really make it pop, but it takes a little bit longer, so there's that. So hopefully these tips have been helpful. Leave a comment and let me know if you have a tip that I didn't share or if you found one particularly helpful. I'll be back next week for another live chat Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. And the winner of the training wheels for quilters is Kathy Cross. So Kathy, leave a comment with your email or email us at customerservice@quiltingismytherapy.com and we'll get that sent out to you. If you want to get your hands on your own quilting training wheels, you can check the link in the description box below. Well, thank you everybody for joining me, whether you're joining live or you're watching this later. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you spending time with me and letting me talk about what I love the most, quilting. So I will see you all next week. Until then, happy quilting.